Welcome back to Bark Bites Comics. I'm your host, Jasper Bark, but you can call me dear old Uncle Jasper. In the comments section of our last show, I asked you for your suggestions on which classic horror comic series I should cover in these shows. An overwhelming number of you suggested Swamp Thing, which is actually a superb suggestion because it's hard to overstate just how big an impact Swamp Thing has had, not just on horror comics or American horror comics, but comics in general over the last 50 years. Such a big impact, in fact, that it's going to take me not one, but 3 shows to properly do this series justice. So, in the first episode, this one, I'm going to be looking at the origins of Swamp Thing and muck monsters in general. In the second episode, I'm going to be looking at the groundbreaking run of British writer Alan Moore on Swamp Thing in the early to mid 80s. And finally, in the third episode, I'm going to be looking at other significant comic creator teams that have worked on Swamp Thing since then. So, buckle up, it's going to be a wild ride. Where does it all start? Well, as far as we're aware, the first fictional appearance of a swamp monster was in the short story It. Not the famous novel by Stephen King. This story was written in 1940 by a writer called Theodore Sturgeon, who was famous for writing horror, fantasy, but mainly science fiction. The story appeared in a now little known pulp called Unknown Worlds that in its day, in the late 30s and early 40s, rivaled Weird Tales for popularity. It was edited by the science fiction editor and author John W. Campbell, and he demanded only the highest standards from his writers, and it certainly shows in it. The story introduces us to a strange vegetable monster made out of muck and weeds that murders first a rabbit, then a dog, then a hunter, then goes on to terrorize a family of farmers before traumatizing a 9-year-old girl, and then it's done away with its nemesis, which is, of all things, simply running water. I guess a creature that's created in a bog of stagnant water would fall prey to running water. In an aside, we later learn that the muck monster became a series of intelligent vegetation that attached itself to the ancient skeleton of a backwoodsman called Roger Kirk. No more explanation is given than this, and in fact, I don't think we need any. The story is strangely atmospheric and incredibly haunting, and it had a huge impact on the field. No less a writer than Ray Bradbury praised it as one of his favourite horror stories, and Roy Thomas, who would go on to become the number 2 at Marvel Comics under Stan Lee, was hugely affected by the story when he read it as a child. In fact, he went on in 1971 to adapt the story for Marvel Comics. This wasn't the first appearance of a muck monster in comics though. Who was the first muck monster? Well, that would be the Heap, who first appeared in 1943 in a Hillman Comics publication called Airboy. Airboy told the stories of daring World War I and World War II airfighters who battled Nazis in the skies. The Heap first appeared as a villain in a backup strip called Skywolf. Skywolf was all about a daring airfighter pilot who went into battle wearing a giant wolf's head on his head as his helmet. In this story, we're introduced to Baron von Emmelmann, a noted German fighter pilot whose biplane crashes into a swamp in Poland. Von Emmelmann's will to live is so great that he refuses to die just because he's gone up in flames and drowned, and he draws all of the swamp's vegetative goodness or badness to him and is resurrected as the monster the Heap, who's sort of a cross between a muck monster, a yeti, a werewolf and a vampire because he drinks blood. The Heap was so popular in this strip that he came back time and again to battle Skywolf, and proved to be so popular that he eventually beat Skywolf and replaced him as the backup strip in Airboy. He went on to be even more popular to the degree that the Heap began to replace Airboy on the cover of his own comic. The series really reaches a creative peak when the creative team of Ed Cronin, editor, and Ernest Schroeder, artist, begin to work on him. This pairing introduced a huge amount of mythology into the Heap's background, including the introduction of the Roman goddess of fertility, Ceres, into the series. Try saying that when you're drunk. Ceres into the series. Anyway, the Heap continues to go from strength to strength until 1953, when waning sales and also a huge moral backlash building against horror comics caused Hillman Publications to shut up shop. But like all great monsters, the Heap wasn't done, and he was resurrected 18 years later in 1971 for a short run in the Skyward series of black and white horror comics, Psycho and Nightmare. He only had a short life there because by 1975 declining sales had put an end to Skyward's brilliant reign of black and white horror comics. But he was going to come back a mere 11 years later in 1986 in issue 3 of Eclipse's newly revamped Airboy comic. By this point, however, he wasn't the most famous swamp monster on the scene. There were a few more contenders for that title. What about Swamp Thing? Swamp Thing first appeared in an 8-page story in DC's mystery title House of Secrets. In the 60s and 70s, the Comics Code Authority forbade any comics publishers from publishing horror comics. So DC had to publish its horror comics under very tight strictures, and it had to call them mystery titles, leaning very much into the Gothic side of comics and the horror genre. House of Secrets 92 includes a story called Swamp Thing, written by Len Wein and drawn by the amazing Bernie Wrightson. The story is all about a bizarre love triangle that takes place in the Victorian era. The love triangle involves Alex Olson, a scientist, his research assistant Damien, and his fiancée Linda. Unfortunately, Damien can't stand the thought of his boss taking the woman that he loves. So he rigs Alex's laboratory to create an explosion, trying to get his rival out of the way. Unfortunately for Damien, the explosion doesn't kill Alex. It just leaves him half dead. So he drags the half-lifeless corpse into the swamp and buries it, and then goes on to marry Linda. This would have been a happily ever after for Damien if not for the fact that Alex comes back as a shambling swamp monster who has nothing better to do than to stalk his ex-fiancée. This is very fortuitous for Linda because she's begun to suspect that perhaps Alex's death wasn't accidental. Realizing this, Damien decides to poison her with a poisonous injection. Before he can do this, Alex, as the muck monster, bursts into the house and throttles his rival. Unfortunately, Linda doesn't quite see it this way. She doesn't see her old fiancé coming back to rescue her. She sees a hideous muck monster burst in and murder her husband. So she recoils in horror from Alex and runs away. At which point Alex realizes that he is never going to be with the love of his life. So he shuffles off, sadly, back into the swamp where he belongs, leaving us all with a huge lump in our throat. This story was incredibly successful in its day, and it more or less birthed an entire legend. What happened next? House of Secrets 92 was DC's best-selling title of that month, outselling bestsellers like Superman and Batman. Publisher Carmine Infantino and editor Joe Orlando realised they had a hit on their hands and very quickly commissioned a series starring the Swamp Thing. Unfortunately, round about the same time that the book came out, Bernie Wrightson left New York to go back to his hometown of Baltimore. This was in the days before either the internet or mobile phones, so he had no idea of the huge success of this 8-page strip, and nobody could reach him to tell him. By the time he got back to New York, people were frantically looking for him and trying to track him down. Unfortunately, when he got together with Len Wein and to work out what they were going to do with their series, both of them had hit a creative block. The 8-page comic had been something of a creative high point for both of the creators, and they weren't sure how on earth they were going to follow it. In fact, the block lasted about a year until it suddenly struck Len Wein that what they would have to do is retell the Swamp Thing's origins, but set it in a modern day setting. So that's why it took nearly a year and a half from its first record-breaking publication in House of Secrets for Swamp Thing to finally start in his own series. But when he did, it was well worth the wait. So how good was the series? Well, in all honesty, the first 10 issues are a high point for 1970s comics. The opening issue tells the story of the scientist, no longer Alex Olson, but Alex Holland, who has moved to a swamp in Louisiana to work on a bio-restorative formula that will allow plants to grow in the most arid and inhospitable environments, thereby solving world hunger. Unfortunately for Alex, this goes against the invested interests of a large criminal corporation called the Conclave, and they send their goons out to do away with Alex. The goons plant a bomb in Alex's laboratory, and when it explodes, Alex runs, his entire body covered in flames, into the swamp and perishes in the swamp water. But the biorestorative formula starts to work on his body and transforms him into the swamp monster we all know and love, Swamp Thing. When the Conclave sends its goons back to the swamp to tie up any loose ends, namely his wife, Linda, Swamp Thing comes to her rescue. In subsequent issues, he would go on to fight a whole series of villains and monsters. Most notable amongst them was his arch nemesis, Anton Arcane, a mad scientist with an army of unmen, which were strange synthesized mutant anthropoids that he would loose upon the Swamp Thing. Arcane is desperate to find the secret of immortal life, and he thinks that Alex, or rather the Swamp Thing, might just be the key to that secret. As well as Arcane, several members of his family also appeared in the strip. There was Grigori Arcane, whose body was blown apart by a landmine and then stitched back together to make the Frankenstein-like monster of the Patchwork Man. There was also Arcane's niece, Abigail, who would become something of a love interest for the Swamp Thing, a relationship that would be picked up on by subsequent writers to incredible effect later on in this series, and also most notably in revamps of the series. As well as Arcane, the Swamp Thing also faced werewolves, he faced witches, he faced a strange village of clockwork androids, and a Lovecraftian deity called Nagala. And even, not quite a monster, more of a hero, Batman. What makes it so good? Well, part of the magic formula was the love that the creators had for the subject matter. The artist, Bernie Wrightson, grew up in the 1950s as a monster kid, one of those kids who grew up watching the old black and white horror movies on television and reading magazines like Famous Monsters of Filmland. He had a real feel for this subject matter, and Len Wein lent into this, taking the Gothic tropes of the 30s and 40s and reframing them in a very contemporary 1970s fashion. Not only that, but Wrightson's work was really coming into its own. His style synthesizes the very best of the old EC horror comic artists like Jack Davis, particularly Graham Garstly Ingalls, and also Wally Wood. But it gives it a very 1970s feel, and he also incorporated the more experimental elements of his European contemporaries. So every page of this particular comic and those first 10 issues absolutely sings. But also we have to take into account the way that each of those first 10 comics were created. It was a hugely collaborative effort. The writer Len Wein and the artist Bernie Wrightson would go into editor Joe Orlando's office and thrash out each issue as a team. Len Wein would come up with story ideas, bouncing them off Joe Orlando, who would make suggestions on the fly, and Bernie Wrightson would sit there with a huge pad sketching out thumbnails for each individual page. When they had the story thrashed out to their satisfaction, Wrightson would take the thumbnails away and draw them up into finished pencils. When he'd done the pencils, he would pass these to Wein. Wein would then write the captions and the dialogue for each page and send it back to Wrightson to ink. When Wrightson had finished inking it, Joe Orlando would do the final finishing touches as an editor, get it coloured and get it printed. And this is why each issue of those first 10 issues is so strong, because each individual collaborator in this process brought out the very best in each other, creating something that none of them could have created by themselves individually. Why did Bernie Wrightson leave? Well, truthfully, he was burnt out. Wrightson is a visionary artist who pours everything he has onto the page. And after 10 issues and nearly 2 years working on this character, he pretty much said everything he wanted to say about monsters, and particularly about swamp monsters. In addition to this, he was offered much better paying work at Warren's line of black and white comics. So, with some regret, he left the book. DC, however, had a hit on its hands and wasn't keen to cancel the series just because its star artist has left. They kept Len Wein on as writer, and they replaced Bernie Wrightson with the Filipino artist Nestor Redondo. Now, Nestor Redondo is one of the most undersung, underappreciated artists of the 70s and early 80s. His work is absolutely beautiful. It's meticulous and highly detailed, and it's very, very realistic. Unfortunately, as brilliant as it is, it doesn't lend itself as well as Wrightson's work to the kind of off-the-wall stories that Swamp Thing was telling. In addition to this, Len Wein had moved from a very collaborative way of creating stories to writing full scripts to send off to Redondo, who lived thousands of miles away. When this creative and collaborative process was taken away from Wein, I think it took away a certain amount of his inspiration as well. He wasn't sparking off his creative teammates in the same way, and his stories become a little bit lackluster. That's why he left the comic by issue 13. He was replaced by a new young writer called David Michelinie. David Michelinie would go on to create some amazing comics, both for DC and for Marvel. He's the guy that turned Iron Man into an alcoholic. That's right, he's the writer who drove Tony Stark to drink. However, working on the Swamp Thing, he was never able to lift the series back to the heights that it had previously held. He limped on, but as his run continued up to issue 24, it began to hemorrhage readers. And by the time he left and was replaced by Jerry Conway, sales were plummeting. Although an issue 25 was advertised, it never hit the stands, and DC cancelled the book in issue 24. However, as we've already established, swamp monsters don't stay dead for very long. And in 1982, the excellent director Wes Craven decided to do a movie based on this property. With a blockbusting movie coming out in theatres all over the States, DC saw huge dollar signs. So they resurrected the title once again, this time calling it Saga of the Swamp Thing. And this they also, once again, put Len Wein in charge of the Swamp Thing, but not as a writer this time, but as the editor of the series. The writer for the first 19 issues was Marty Pasco. Marty Pasco did an okay job, but he was just beginning a career in television, and I think his attention was elsewhere. He left with book 19, and In an unprecedented and an incredibly inspired move, Len Wein offered the book to a then completely unknown British writer called Alan Moore. Nobody could have guessed at the heights to which Moore was going to take the book over the next 3-4 years. However, that is another story for another episode. What's my current horror comic recommendation for this show? Well, I think you should all be reading World Tree by the artist Fernando Blanco and the writer James Tynion IV, who's responsible for such modern classics as Nice House on the Lake, Something is Killing the Children, and Department of Truth. World Tree tells the story of a series of computer geek misfits led by a guy called Gabriel, who as teens discover there is a secret hidden architecture underneath the internet called the Undernet, and something incredibly dangerous and highly malevolent is growing there. As teens, they're able to cut off the Undernet from access to the rest of the world and vanquish the terror that they've faced. Unfortunately, like all great monsters in horror comics, the vanquishing was only temporary. Now the threat is back and it's more dangerous than ever. And the only people who can stop it, of course, are Gabriel and his misfits. So far, at the time of recording, there are currently 2 volumes out in this series, collecting the first 10 issues. I do know that in October, they're going to publish a 3rd volume, collecting the next 5. I suggest you make your way down to your favourite comics pusher and buy as many volumes as you can lay your hands on. I can promise you, you will not be sorry. And now, the news. My first piece of news is about the Tripwire From the Archives Volume 1 Kickstarter. Tripwire is the UK's longest running magazine and website covering comic news and comic related matters. They've been going for over 3 decades now, and the From the Archives project is a collection of their most interesting and enlightening interviews with the top creators from the past 3 decades. We'll leave a link down in the comments section for you to click on and back this Kickstarter, because you really should. My other piece of news concerns Black Forests from Scratch Comics. Scratch Comics are a leading British independent comics publisher run by Shane Chebsey, and Black Forests is an anthology of 6 stories all written by the scribe Peter Hogan. If you don't know the name Peter Hogan, you probably do know the name of his most famous creation, the comic Resident Alien, written by him and drawn by Steve Parkhouse, that has become an incredibly successful series on Netflix. This anthology at the time of recording is just about to hit the comic shelves. So make your way down to your favourite comic shop and buy a copy now. Trust your Uncle Jasper on this. You know it makes sense. Guys, I have a bit of a postscript to this episode. As I was researching Swamp Thing, I went back to the original run of Swamp Thing comics that I collected when I was a callow youth about 30 years ago, working in a comic shop in Notting Hill. I took them out of their Mylar bags for perhaps the first time in goodness knows how many decades, and I discovered something when I opened my copy of Swamp Thing issue number 1. What I had never realised before, and perhaps because I've never actually opened this because I've always had reading copies, which I've now gotten rid of, is this first issue was in fact signed by none other than the artist Bernie Wrightson. I had no idea until a few hours ago when I opened this. How about that for a lucky find?